Now I'd like to talk about history as a constraint. Like, what is the role that history plays? What came before, and how does that create obligation for what comes in the future? And so history, let's think of this as the obligations that are created by past beliefs. You know how yesterday's actions and experiences and decisions shape, that is constrain, right, today's options and the things that we have as possibilities today. And so if we're going to innovate, to what extent do we have to take account of what came before? You know, the past really is never dead. It just sort of it keeps coming back and asserting itself in different ways. And so that's what we have to watch out for, is when things in the past, we're not aware of them, we don't understand why they are the way they are, and what it is that we have to do in order to acknowledge that. That is to honor what came before in a way that allows us to move forward and does not constrain what we're trying to do, go forward. So I want to talk about three things. Things in the world, that is sort of the physical infrastructure, the things we connect to. I want to talk about knowledge in the world, the skills and practices, the things that people know and how they know them, things that the people have come to understand, and the understanding in the world, the kind of cultural practices and traditions and what kind of obligation that creates that we have to consider as we innovate at a societal level. So, things in the world. Think about things in the world, like the infrastructure. So if you have a Segway, you're not allowed to drive on the street, you're not allowed to drive on the sidewalk, well, this becomes a problem. The Segway needed this infrastructure in order to allow adoption to happen. And without the infrastructure, without the place to ride it, it was a dead innovation. Let me show you another innovation, early problem, the typewriter. So the early typewriters were problematic because they had laid out the keyboards alphabetically, and as people would learn to type and type faster and faster, they were constant jams. And so these kind of jams, I don't know if you've ever played with a typewriter like this, so it's really easy to get the keys to jam up. And so in the late 1800s, I think it was like 1868 maybe, a guy, Christopher Sholes, came up with a different layout. And so what he figured out was that there are these keystrokes that are in close having keys that are close to each other made these mechanical things that go up close to each other, and they would jam. And so what he said was, I'll spread out the frequency of these letters, in essence slowing down the person from typing, and it'll create fewer jams. And so basically he spread it out, and he came up with what's called the QWERTY keyboard, the QWERTY, which is named for the top row of letters across the keyboard, as you can see here. So people liked the QWERTY keyboard, people learned how to use it, people were going along with it. You know, it wasn't quite as fast as it could be, but nonetheless it was, people thought, yeah, this is great. Soon someone came out with a different keyboard, and this was Blickensderfer, and he came out with a keyboard. It was faster, it was lighter, it was cheaper, and also it did not jam. And the reason it didn't jam was it used a ball, sort of like an IBM Selectric. If you've seen one of those, it has a little ball with all the letters on it, and it'd go that way. It was mechanical, and it was about 20 years later. In fact, it was very, very superior to the Remington from a technical point of view, but was unable to take over. What had happened in the intervening 20 years, so when Remington bought the rights to the Sholes keyboard, to the QWERTY keyboard, they started a number of secretary schools. They started professionalizing basically the profession of being a secretary. They had people learn how to do it. So they had about 20 years of head start, and even though something came along that was better, faster, cheaper, they were unable to unseat it. That people said no thanks because the keyboard layout was different than the QWERTY keyboard layout. You might have had something like this, like there's a Dvorak keyboard. Even nowadays you have an option in a computer, you can actually change the keyboard, and yet people don't. Why not? Well, we have this installed base, right? There's knowledge in the world. We know how to do it. We know this way, this infrastructure's there, and so if I were to produce a keyboard that looked like one of these other things here, it would be hard for people to learn. I couldn't be assured that there are enough people in the world who knew how to do that. The QWERTY keyboard, on the other hand, I can assume that everyone knows how to use that keyboard. Here's another keyboard, the piano keyboard. This thing drives me crazy. It's got like 3 keys, and then 2, then 3, then 2, the black keys, and then there's some place, sometimes people know up there, and they push, they know which one to push. It really is actually kind of perplexing. Actually, I know how to play the piano, and it's still perplexing to me, because as you try to learn more and more things, it's not intuitive at all. And yet, if you were to produce something that you're going to call a keyboard, it pretty much has to look like this, because there's a history, and that history creates obligation for going forward. Unless what I was doing had something to do with these keys, I probably should pretty much stick to that kind of keyboard layout if I want to assume that there are people in the world who can actually use the thing that I'm proposing, the innovation. Back around the time of the invention of the gramophone, Thomas Edison, what he would do is we had the gramophone and then a live person play behind a screen and try to get people, train people to hear the difference between them, to say, you know what, in fact, this device is actually, this gramophone is actually superior to this person playing, because the person playing will make mistakes, it won't sound as good, it doesn't sound as in the same way as this gramophone here. And so it had reverb, it had all sorts of things that sort of, the sound of the room came with the gramophone, which is where the person behind the screen didn't sound as good. And so what was happening was there these understandings in the world about what music is, what does it mean to consume music, that he was actually changing by doing this. In fact, this was an early stage, an early version of the, you may be of a generation where you remember there's some ads that were, is it live or is it Memorex? And so he was doing this a long time before that. Even later, there's still this idea of what is high-end stereo. You know, was it vinyl, is it CDs, is it MP3s? And that people keep, you know, there's a constant debate about this, about what does it mean to hear, how can you hear these different kinds of music in some way? What is it better? What does it mean to be high-end? And these are things that people have an understanding of, distinct opinions about. And so the history of what came before is something we have to account for, and our beliefs about these things. Also, if we look back at the industry constraints we talked about last week, about the market. So if I have a lot of vinyl, I'm really reluctant to buy a bunch of CDs. If I have a bunch of CDs, I'm really reluctant to go to MP3s. And so this kind of adoption cost was worth thinking about here as well. So in addition to the history creating this kind of knowledge in the world, these things that people know, it also creates these adoption costs, these changes that we have to make in order to change our lives around these new things. We adopt innovations for what they say about us. And so is there a good reason to stand in line, you know, at the Apple store, wherever, in the iStore, the G phone store, and stand around the block, you know, and sleep there and camp out there overnight for that device, when you can just order online, when you can just get it a few days later? I mean, do you really need to make a phone call that day with that thing? Why do people do that? Well, it's about what this says about them. So it's more than just the function of the device, it really is what the device says about them. If I have one of these, then I'm one of those kind of people, and those kind of people who is desirable in a certain way. And so what it says about us is an important aspect of this, about this knowledge in the world, because people understand what it is, people understand how to interpret this thing, and so when they see you with it, they understand, oh, he's one of those people like that. So these three ways of history, things in the world, you know, the physical things, the infrastructure, the things that we connect to, knowledge in the world, the skills and practices that we undertake and what they mean, and then also our understandings in the world, the cultural practices and the traditions that we have, and how it is that we express those traditions through time. So if we want to overcome history constraints, again, I think overcoming is kind of a strong word. I think it's if we want to understand history constraints and how it is that we can operate within them, then I'll offer the following. Let's think about these three things, like things in the world, knowledge in the world, and understandings in the world. Think about the physical infrastructure. I understand, and I've spent a little time with the people creating the Nissan Leaf. And one thing that's happening here is there's a company that is putting charging stations up and down and across the state of Tennessee, where Nissan headquarters is. So there's one problem, which is the cars, if you want to fast charge them, if you want to charge them quickly, they require a high voltage power system of 480 volts. And the problem is basically there are gas stations everywhere, but there's not everywhere where you can get 480 volts. Most homes will not have access to 480 volts. It's usually industrial places or eating establishments, places like that. Eating establishments have them because they have large ovens and large washers and large machines and heaters and things like that. And so they have that kind of voltage there. So what they did was they actually partnered up with these eating places to say, you have the infrastructure in place, you have the 480 volts and that kind of thing we need, and we have people, you know, that we can bring, and so let's collaborate on this, and let's actually leverage the infrastructure that you have and allow us to charge cars while people are here. In fact, you can charge one of these cars to about 80 or 90% of charge within half an hour, which is maybe about the time that a person would spend inside of a small restaurant or inside of a place like this. I believe it's Cracker Barrel in Nashville, although I have seen some in other places as well. In Walmart, I've seen chargers in places where people would go and spend some time, and where the infrastructure is accessible. So again, this car would be very difficult to bring out if it weren't for the infrastructure. Consider also, this was very similar to the digital camera. And the digital camera was Sony focused on the camera, whereas the infrastructure was also being done by others. So the printing was being done by HP, the hard drive was being done by Connor, the CPU was being done by Intel, and so as those things were done, that they became the infrastructure to allow the digital camera to exist. And so again, this is sort of understanding what's out there, right, as a way of being able to leverage, being able to use to help our innovation move forward. Knowledge and practices in the world, what are the skills and practices that people have, and how do they have that? I don't know if you've ever had the experience where you walk up to a door and you're pushing on it, it won't open. It's like you keep trying to push it, and then someone says, hey, wait a minute, that's a pulling door, not a pushing door. And you say, why? It looks like it should be a pushing door. I don't understand this. A friend and colleague, Donald Norman, wrote a great book called The Design of Everyday Things. So it's about design and about how we design things that are actually not intuitive. People know a lot of things, but there is knowledge in the world, and so why don't we use that? If people know things like how to hold something or how to operate something, why not use that in your innovation? Because if people have to learn new things, they're much more likely to not adopt, because the things that we don't understand, we're much more likely to reject than things that we do understand. So there is this knowledge in the world that comes from history, that comes from people's past experiences, so use that. We should definitely be using that knowledge in the world. Then there's this thing of understanding the cultural practices in the world that, there are open standards. A soda, there's a soft drink, they generally come in 12-ounce sizes, right? And that's a standard. And so unless you have a really good reason for not using a 12-ounce cup or a 12-ounce drink and you're making a drink, use 12 ounces, because the machines will hold that. Everything's about that. If you're trying to make some change around that, then that's fine, but don't make arbitrary changes just to make changes. JPEG standard, JPEG, the photographic standard. If you're doing something photographic, use the standard. Unless you have a really good reason not to, then you should use it. People will complain about it and say, oh, it's terrible, it's blocky, it has, it's not as good as it could be. Well, if you change it, just to change it, it's very unlikely that people are going to adopt that, because cameras don't work on it and there's not all the software that works on it, and people understand JPEG and want to use it, and so allow them to use it unless you have a very, very good reason not to, and then you need to explain to people why it is that this is not JPEG, why it is you want to use something else. So these three ways of history, things in the world, knowledge in the world, and understandings in the world, are things we can leverage, that we can use. It's not about overcoming adoption, but we can actually use them to help us drive adoption of our innovations in the end. So how do we overcome these societal constraints? Is that really the goal here? So again, I've been saying all along, it's really not about subverting society, that societal constraints have a role, that they have something important in them. It's about protecting society. It could be that society is right, that your proposition for change is just, is not going to work, that it's going to be harmful to you, it's going to be harmful to society. And so again, we want to consider these things. What are the values and the identity that drives? How is social control likely to be asserted around our innovation? And also, what's the role of history in terms of what our proposition for change is? How are we changing? And is there any obligation that we have to the past in the direction that we change? So with that, that closes out our discussion of societal constraints. And next up is the segue case. What I need you to do is read the segue case before you actually go to the video, and then watch the video, and we'll talk about and debrief the segue case.